If you are someone who has a passion for a specific medium or format, whether that be books, TV shows, music, or films, there is always that one specific thing in that medium that first sparked your love for it. For instance, if you are massively into music, there is always that one song or album that you can always turn to as saying, that is the thing that got me into music in the first place. And as a massive film person, that question actually gets asked to me quite a bit as well. What was the film that got you into film in the first place? And for me, there are two films in particular, funnily enough both from 2010, that first sparked my love not just for film in general, but my interest in wanting to make films as well. The first of those was Christopher Nolan's Inception, and considering its inception, you can probably figure out a million different reasons why that film was one of the first films that properly sparked my interest in the medium in the first place. But my second choice, however, is one that not necessarily a lot of people would first think of when asking said question, and that is Gareth Edwards' directorial debut, Monsters. Now, I know what some of you might be thinking. How can a small indie film from 2010 be the catalyst for a lifelong passion that I still care very deeply about? And there is one very simple answer to that. I had the exact same personal reaction from Monsters that I did with Inception, which wasn't just a sense of awe and amazement in terms of what I was seeing, but more coming from a perspective of how the actual fuck did they make that thing. Which is why I find Monsters such a fascinating film to look at, no matter how many times I rewatch it. The film, at face value, is a very interesting one at that, because it sets up a very specific style and tone, especially if you look at like the Blu-ray cover or the poster. It kind of sets up a specific tone that you don't necessarily get in the actual film. However, when you do watch the film, it opens up this entire new possibility that I didn't think was doable within that sort of alien invasion subgenre. However, if you go one step further and look at the making of Monsters, the behind the scenes of the film is almost more interesting than the actual film itself. And that's not to say the film is bad by any means. I love the film even to this day. But trust me, the making of this film is so incredibly fascinating that when I found out more and more in terms of how they made it, again, that just deepened my interest in film and wanting to make films even further. Because for those of you that maybe don't know the film that well, Gareth Edwards and the two actors, Scoot McNairy and Whitney Able, basically went into Mexico and kind of filmed it guerrilla style. They didn't really have a set out plan, they just improvised a lot of the dialogue scenes on the spot, and he literally just took his camera, one sound guy, and they just went out filming the two actors interacting with the people and the surroundings, and then worked around that. Now, most of the time when that sort of thing happens, and I know from experience, sometimes things don't necessarily go that well. Like, if you just go out there hoping to film something and don't necessarily plan it that in depth, a lot of the times it can just fall apart. Sometimes it works in your favour, like it does in Monsters, but there are other times where you start to think to yourself, yeah, maybe we should have planned this a bit more in advance. But with Monsters, there is a certain sense of authenticity and realism that you don't necessarily get with a lot of films in this sort of subgenre. And that's what I love about the film. It's almost got a very lived-in, almost documentary approach to it, especially in terms of the camera work and the cinematography. In that regard, it's not necessarily one of the best looking movies I've ever seen, but it works for the sake of the story they are trying to tell. And on a side note, there is one thing about this film that, again, you don't necessarily get advertised when you see like the poster for it or the trailer even, but it is one thing about this film that I've always loved, and it's something that Gareth Edwards has continued to do in the other two films that he has made with much bigger budgets and productions, that again, I still love the fact that he is doing that thing, and that is that on a face value, when you look at the very concept of the films that he does, these are very grand, big scale sci-fi films. However, the films are not necessarily about that. The films are very focused on the characters that happen to be sucked up in the middle of it, and it is more about their interactions with each other and how they react to what is going on around them. For example, in Monsters, the main focus of the film isn't necessarily the monsters, it's how these two people from completely different backgrounds end up growing a relationship between each other and again react to the world around them and start to blossom this relationship that wasn't initially there. And again, this is something that Edwards sort of repeats in his other two films, Godzilla and Rogue One. Godzilla is technically about Godzilla, but the main focus is the human characters on the ground, and that is the main focus. And whenever Godzilla or any of the monsters do appear, it is always from their perspective, which is why I love that film so much. And then you have Rogue One, which purely focuses on that group for the majority of the runtime, so that when these big battles do happen towards the back half of the movie, again, it is mostly from their perspective, hence why it works as well as it does. You've got to know them more and more over the course of the film, although that being said, Rogue One maybe isn't the best example because they could have gone a bit further with character development. However, you get what I mean. The core idea is still there. You build up a lot of time getting to know these characters and purely watch the film from their perspective, so that when these big set pieces do happen, again, you are still stuck with their perspective and you care about them a lot more. One of my favourite aspects of Monsters, and is a useless bit of trivia that I love just saying to anyone that's never seen the film before, is the fact that Gareth Edwards himself edited the film and also did all of the CGI and special effects himself on a laptop. Yet the end result looks pretty damn good. There are a couple of shots here and there in like the earlier half of the film where the CGI is a little bit noticeable, but when you get to the big showpiece final scene where you see the aliens in their full glory for the first time, his CGI still holds up, and that is really impressive. The fact that he did it all on a laptop and it still looks as good as it does today, that's really impressive. And again, I think finding out more about how this film was made and how Gareth did a lot of the work himself and made it as good as it was encouraged me in later years when making my own things to kind of go, right, this sort of stuff is doable, you just need to know what you're doing and you can do stuff on your own to an extent. Listen, I don't know if this is going to end up being a very long video or a really short one, but I just wanted to make a video talking about Monsters because I love it so much. It's a film that sparked my interest not just in cinema, but how to make films in the first place. And when you look at it just purely as a film, I think it still works incredibly well. The camera work, like I said, isn't anything particularly special, but it works for the sake of putting you in the middle of the moment, and there is a certain grounded sense of realism that you get from this very handheld approach of camera work that also has a very grainy, textured look to it that again fits in with the documentary aspect that I mentioned earlier. Plus the two main actors in the film are absolutely brilliant, and I think what also helps is that when they filmed the film, they were an actual couple. They weren't just two random actors that kind of had to produce chemistry out of nowhere for the sake of the film. At the time of making Monsters, they were an actual couple, hence why their chemistry is so believable and good, because they are actually together. And on top of all of that, you have a criminally underrated score by one of my favourite artists of all time, John Hopkins. It blends his usual electronic stuff with these incredibly simple but effective orchestral swells of music, and it is such a good soundtrack. I implore you to watch the film and then just go listen to the soundtrack on its own, because it is one of my favourite soundtracks of all time, and it just works. Monsters is also a very good example of what you can do with very little, not just in terms of how they made it, but also in terms of like the ideas and concept of this film as well. Because again, when you look at it at face value and when you go into the film for the first time, you expect something big and grand, and to be honest, when you get further into the film, you do start to get those certain concepts and ideas popping up in terms of the scale of the thing that these two characters are stuck in. But again, because Gareth Edwards focuses more on the main two characters and their interactions with each other, as well as their reaction to the world around them, it grounds everything back down to a personal level, which makes a film with necessarily huge ideas feel a lot more intimate and relatable, which I personally love. And again, I hadn't really seen in a film like this at that time that I saw it for the first time. Anyway, that's enough of me gushing about Monsters and how much I love it. If you've seen the film, then please let me know in the comments what you think of Monsters, or even just Gareth Edwards' other films as well and his approach to filmmaking. I'd love to just have a discussion in the comments about any of them. If you liked the video, then give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, and I will see you all in the next one. Bye.